Liberty, Washington, D.C., was built on a terrible, thriving lie. A world where the Capitol Dome, a beacon of democracy, cast its shadow daily over the largest open-air slave market in North America. This is the real story of the 1840s, a decade often forgotten, when the capital of the United States was, quite literally, a slave-holding district, and every politician in its halls knew it. Before the cannons of the Civil War fired, before the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the most audacious, high-stakes escape attempt in American history unfolded silently in the shadow of the White House. It was an escape planned not by hardened men, but by a quiet, determined black woman named Mary Millburn. Chapter 1. The Weight of the Capitol. The year was 1848, and Washington City was a place of magnificent hypocrisy. Marble and granite structures rose from the swampy land, monuments to an ideal of freedom that existed only on paper for 1/5 of its population. The air, heavy and humid even in spring, carried the scent of newly sawn timber, cherry blossoms, and, if the wind was right, the unmistakable odor of the 7th Street slave pen. Mary Millburn had been born into this suffocating reality. She was a free woman, granted her papers years ago, but her life was irrevocably woven into the fate of her family, her husband, their children, and many of their friends who remained enslaved in the wealthy households of the district. Mary worked as a domestic, scrubbing the elegant floors of Georgetown mansions, serving tea to congressmen, and all the while she carried a map of the city in her mind, marking the locations of the slave pens and the docks like military targets. She knew the city's hidden pulse. She knew that every day men like Beverly Jones, a notorious local slave trader, strolled past the Treasury building with the same casual impunity as any senator. Jones's business was brisk, taking human beings, husbands, wives, children from the Upper South and selling them downriver to the monstrous cotton and sugar plantations of New Orleans and Mississippi. This domestic slave trade was Washington's booming, brutal economy. Mary often looked at the Potomac River, wide and dark, and imagined it as the road to salvation. She wasn't just planning an escape. She was planning an exodus. The audacious plan. The idea, when it first took hold in the winter of 1847, was deemed impossible, perhaps insane. It started with Mary and a few trusted men, including Paul Jennings, a former slave of James Madison, who now worked for Congressman Daniel Webster, and a daring white man named Captain Edward Sayres. Sayres was the owner of the Pearl, a beautiful, two-masted schooner built for speed. The plan was simple on paper, yet utterly unprecedented in its scale. To secretly gather 77 enslaved men, women, and children from various homes and plantations across Washington and Georgetown. To lead them, under the cloak of a moonless April night, to the pier and to sail them, 77 souls packed below deck, nearly 200 miles down the Potomac River and out into the vast protective bay of the Chesapeake, finally reaching the free state of New Jersey. Mary and Sayres chose Saturday, April 15, 1848 for the escape. It was the night before the Easter holiday, a time when surveillance was lax and masters were distracted. The number 77 was a gamble, a logistical nightmare, and a prayer rolled into one. If even one person faltered, if one child cried out, or if the intricate network of rumors and hushed conversations broke, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for the escapees, but for the free black community that helped them. Mary's heart hammered a rhythm of fear and hope as the date approached. She personally guided family after family, whispering instructions: bring no baggage, wear dark clothes, do not look up at the moon, the river is our only witness. She was the conductor of this silent 77-part symphony of freedom, played under the watchful, yet blind, eyes of the capital of the free world.
Chapter 2. The Night of the Pearl. The Rendezvous. Saturday, April 15, 1848. A cold, damp fog rolled off the Potomac, muffling the usual sounds of Washington City. This was a gift to Mary Millburn and her allies. The atmosphere was dense, heavy not just with humidity, but with a palpable current of risk. The 77 people were not gathered in one spot. They moved through the capital in small, disconnected groups, 3 here, 5 there, each led by a trusted conductor who knew the winding alleys and back paths of the city. These groups consisted of the elite enslaved from the houses of Georgetown, the skilled laborers from the Navy Yard, and field hands from nearby farms in Maryland. Among them were the Edmondson sisters, Emily and Mary, 2 young women whose courage would soon make them symbols of the abolitionist cause. Mary Millburn, positioned near the 7th Street wharf, watched the clock of the Capitol building. Every shadow that moved was a potential informer. Every carriage wheel on the cobblestones sounded like the alarm. The plan required precision. The groups had to arrive at the Pearl, the sleek, fast schooner anchored discreetly offshore, between 10 p.m. and midnight. Captain Sayers and his white assistant, Daniel Drayton, were aboard the Pearl, tense and ready. They had disguised the vessel, hoping to pass as a fruit and oyster sloop bound for Alexandria. Below deck, the cargo hold had been emptied, straw laid down, and water casks filled. The boarding. The first group arrived precisely on time, emerging from the fog like ghosts. They were met by Samuel and Paul Edmondson, free black laborers who helped row the groups out to the schooner in a small pilot boat. The process was agonizingly slow and silent. Each person had to be ferried out in the pitch-black river, quietly taken below deck and positioned in the cramped, airless hold. The Edmondson sisters, Emily and Mary, arrived holding hands, their fear masked by sheer determination. They knew that if caught, they would not merely be returned to their owner, Lawrence Washington, a grandnephew of the first president. They would be sold immediately to the Deep South, a living death sentence. Mary Millburn watched her own family board, her heart clenched with a mix of relief and terror. She calculated the risk: 77 lives below, Captain Sayers and Drayton on deck, and 2 small pilot boats making round trips in total darkness. By midnight, the last of the 77 had been crammed into the hold. The air was thick with body heat and silent prayer. Mary, standing on the wharf, exchanged a final wordless nod with Drayton, who was preparing to hoist the anchor. Fleeing the Capitol's shadow. Just after midnight, the Pearl weighed anchor and slipped silently down the Potomac River. The wind was favorable, driving the schooner swiftly past Alexandria, past Mount Vernon, and towards the vastness of the Chesapeake Bay. For the next 12 hours, the 77 souls experienced a fleeting, intoxicating taste of freedom. They were no longer the property of men. They were passengers on a vessel of hope. The passengers were led to believe that by morning they would be clear, but they had not accounted for the betrayal that was already brewing back in the city they had left. The break of dawn and the alarm. Sunday morning, as the slaveholders of Washington, D.C. prepared for their Easter services, they noticed the empty rooms, the missing faces. A widespread panic erupted simultaneously in Georgetown and the Capitol. 77 people, a massive exodus, gone. The planters and traders, led by the ruthless Beverly Jones, quickly banded together. They knew the river was the only path. Jones and his posse gathered a contingent of armed men and secured a fast, powerful steamer called the Salem. It was built for speed, not subtlety, and it was faster than any sailing schooner. Their mission was clear: pursue the pearl, capture the cargo, and make an example of every single runaway and every abolitionist accomplice involved. The chase was on. To be continued. What would you like to explore in the next chapter? We can cover the chase on the Chesapeake, the capture, or the immediate public and political fallout in Washington, D.C.
Chapter 3. The Winds of Betrayal. The Pursuit on the Potomac. The runaways aboard the Pearl believed they were home free. Below deck, the air was stifling, but the sound of the schooner cutting through the water, coupled with the rhythmic creaking of the hull, was the sweet sound of hope. Captain Sayers, pushing the small vessel to its limit, kept a vigilant watch. However, they were betrayed not by a runaway, but by the weather. Just as the Pearl was nearing the mouth of the Potomac, where it meets the vast Chesapeake Bay, the wind suddenly died. The sails went slack, and the swift schooner was reduced to drifting helplessly, a cork bobbing on the water. Meanwhile, the slave catchers, fueled by rage and the promise of huge rewards, were closing fast. The steamer Salem, carrying Beverly Jones and a heavily armed posse of planters and traders, was moving at incredible speed. Their mission was economic warfare. The loss of 77 enslaved people represented a financial blow of over $100,000, well over $3 million in modern currency, to the district's elite. The capture. It was early Sunday afternoon when the sound of a powerful engine grew loud on the water. Captain Sayers immediately recognized the dreadful roar of a steamer. He saw the smoke plume first, then the black hull of the Salem bearing down on them. With his vessel dead in the water, Sayers knew resistance was futile. He could not risk a bloody gunfight that would certainly result in the murder of the defenseless people below. The Salem pulled alongside the Pearl. Beverly Jones, rifle in hand, immediately recognized Sayers and his assistant, Daniel Drayton. "You're caught, abolitionist thief. Where is the cargo?" Jones roared. Sayers and Drayton were immediately overpowered and bound. Then came the terrible task of bringing the fugitives up from the hold. The scene on the deck was one of devastating reversal. The 77 hopefuls, who had dreamed of freedom just hours earlier, emerged blinking into the sunlight, only to face the grinning armed faces of their former masters and the brutal slave traders. Women screamed, children cried, and the men of the group were quickly separated and brutally shackled. The sheer scale of the operation, the largest collective escape attempt in American history, was now its undoing. 77 people were forcibly transferred to the Salem, which turned around and steamed straight back upriver, a triumphant procession of cruelty, back to the heart of the capital they had tried to flee. The return to Washington, D.C. The spectacle of the return was intentional, a public, humiliating display meant to crush the spirit of the entire free black community and remind the nation of the power of slaveholders. When the Salem docked at the wharf, a huge, angry mob of white citizens gathered. They did not cheer the return of democracy, they celebrated the return of property. Mary Millburn's worst fears were realized. Her family and the 77 others were marched through the streets they had silently crossed just hours earlier, this time in chains, past the very buildings dedicated to liberty. They were all taken to the infamous Alexandria jail, known as the slave pen, to await judgment and the inevitable sale to the unforgiving plantations of the Deep South. The immediate reaction was twofold: terror for the runaways and a political firestorm that would soon engulf the U.S. Congress. The audacity of the Pearl incident had just forced the issue of slavery in the nation's capital into a political crisis. Chapter 4.
The Capitol on trial. The political earthquake. The capture of the Pearl and its 77 passengers did not quiet the issue of slavery in Washington, D.C. It exploded it. This was no ordinary escape. The sheer number of runaways and the involvement of white abolitionist captains turned the incident into a national symbol. Northern abolitionist newspapers, seizing on the drama, branded the nation's capital as a slave-catching district, where the halls of Congress overlooked the auction block. They immediately raised funds to cover the astronomical costs of legal defense, and more importantly, to purchase the freedom of the captured individuals. Southern politicians, meanwhile, were apoplectic. They saw the Pearl incident as an act of war, demanding harsh punishment for Captain Edward Sayres and Daniel Drayton to send a chilling message to any future abolitionist sympathizers. The fate of the 77. For the 77 souls chained in the damp, dark Alexandria jail, the political maneuvering meant nothing compared to their immediate fate. Their owners, furious at the betrayal and needing to make an example, refused all offers from abolitionists to purchase their freedom at a fair price. Instead, they demanded an exorbitant penalty, and when that was refused, they prepared for the worst, selling them to the Deep South. The group was quickly dispersed. The men were often the first to go, sold to the brutal cotton fields of the Deep South. The Edmondson sisters, Emily and Mary, were separated from their parents and placed on the market, their youth and beauty making them especially valuable for what was known as fancy trade, a euphemism for sexual exploitation. This horrified the nation and became a powerful rallying cry for the abolitionist movement. The trial of the captains. While the families were being torn apart, the focus of the white public rested on the trials of Captain Edward Sayres and Daniel Drayton. They were charged not with kidnapping, but with the theft of property. 77 counts of stealing human beings, each count carrying a heavy penalty. The trials became a legal circus. The prosecution argued that the abolitionists were inciting insurrection and violating the fundamental economic rights of slave owners. The defense, funded by wealthy New York abolitionists, argued that the right to liberty superseded property laws. They brought in high-profile lawyers, including the legendary Salmon P. Chase, who would later become Lincoln's Treasury Secretary. Despite the high-powered defense, the political climate in D.C. ensured the outcome. Both Sayres and Drayton were found guilty on all counts. Their sentences were crushing, years in prison and staggering fines that totaled over $20,000, a fortune at the time. The slaveholders had won a legal victory that seemed total. Hope from the haze. But the persecution of the captains and the devastating plight of the Edmondson sisters provided the final necessary spark for the abolitionists. The legendary orator and former slave Frederick Douglass used the incident to expose the hypocrisy of the American capital. The story of Emily and Mary Edmondson in particular circulated widely in Northern papers, putting immense public pressure on the government. Against all odds, the abolitionist network, through tireless effort and donations, was able to raise enough money to buy the freedom of 40 of the 77 individuals, including Mary Millburn's entire family, and eventually the Edmondson sisters themselves. Their freedom was a financial miracle, but it could not erase the emotional scars or undo the fate of the remaining 37 who were lost to the Cotton States. The Pearl incident ultimately served a purpose far beyond its failure. It publicly shamed Washington, D.C., and gave the abolitionists an unanswerable piece of evidence that the Capitol was a moral cesspool. It led directly to the eventual ban of the slave trade in the district in 1850, marking the first tangible, though incomplete, legal victory for freedom in the nation's heart.
Chapter 5.
Freedom's Aftermath and the Path to War. The Price of Liberty. The legal defeat of Captains Sayers and Drayton, combined with the tragic dispersal of many of the fugitives, could have marked the end of the Pearl incident, but the determined efforts of abolitionists ensured it became a rallying point. The most famous rescue story belonged to the sisters, Emily and Mary Edmondson. Despite being purchased by a Georgia slave trader and sent to the infamous New Orleans market, their plight had galvanized the nation. Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, one of the most powerful abolitionist voices in the North, and his congregation, raised the immense sum needed for their ransom. The sisters were freed and brought north, their story printed and reprinted across the country. They went on to receive an education at Oberlin College, and their testimony provided undeniable human evidence of the savagery of the domestic slave trade originating in the nation's capital. Mary Millburn and her family, whose escape was initially the driving force, were also successfully purchased and settled into free life, though they carried the deep trauma of the near disaster and the loss of their friends. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The rage and humiliation felt by Southern politicians in Washington, D.C. over the Pearl incident had profound legislative consequences. They demanded legal assurances that such an escape could never be attempted again, and that their property could never truly be safe, even in the North. The resulting political maneuvering led directly to the Compromise of 1850, a package of 5 bills intended to solve the escalating tension. The bill that became the most controversial and destructive was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This act effectively nationalized the pursuit of runaways, making it a federal offense for authorities, citizens, or abolitionists in free states to refuse to help capture and return escaped slaves. It was a direct response to events like the Pearl and ensured that the long arm of the slave power extended deep into the North, radicalizing countless moderate Northerners and pushing the country closer to war than a decade later. The fate of the captains. While the runaways found varying degrees of freedom, Captain Edward Sayers and Daniel Drayton remained imprisoned, serving their exorbitant sentences. They endured years of harsh conditions, becoming martyrs for the abolitionist cause. After 4 years in prison, they were finally pardoned in 1852, thanks to intense political pressure orchestrated by figures like Senator Charles Sumner and Congressman Gerrit Smith, who covered the massive fines themselves. They were hailed as heroes upon their release, their suffering seen as a sacrifice made on the altar of liberty. A prelude to war. The Pearl incident was not merely a failed escape, it was a critical flashpoint. It demonstrated the hypocrisy of Washington, D.C. as a capital of liberty that was simultaneously a major slave port, leading to the ban on the slave trade, though not slavery itself, in the district in 1850. It provided the emotional fuel and legal justification for the deeply divisive Fugitive Slave Act. It armed the abolitionist movement with a powerful, personalized narrative of courage, the Edmondson sisters, and sacrifice, the Sayers and Drayton, transforming abstract moral arguments into palpable, human stories that reached millions of American hearts. The silent exodus of 77 souls on the Pearl helped tear away the polite political facade of the 1850s, revealing the irreconcilable moral chasm between North and South. It proved that freedom seekers would risk annihilation